So what's your name?
Alecia.
Alecia? How important do you think Joseph Plumb Martin is to the interpretation of the American Revolution and Yorktown?
Honestly, I think he's really important. Joseph Plumb Martin, he was your average, everyday kind of person. A lot of the times when you learn about the American Revolution or you read books about it, quite often they'll kind of detail more of the well-known people, General Washington, Jefferson, everybody like that. But Joseph Plumb Martin was your average, everyday soldier, and that's part of the story you don't really hear that much about. And he gives us some awesome insight into just the everyday lives that these soldiers would have lived while they were in the army here.
Part 1, Take 2. Here we are at the trenches, the first line of trenches, and Joseph Plumb Martin writes this. In a short time, the engineers returned, and the aforementioned stranger with them. They discoursed together sometime when, by the officers often calling him, Your Excellency, we discovered that it was General Washington. Had we dared, we might have cautioned him for exposing himself so carelessly to the danger at such a time, and doubtless he would have taken it in good part if we had. But nothing ill happened to him or ourselves. It coming on to rain hard, we were ordered back to our tents, and nothing more was done that night. The next night, which was the 6th of October, the same men were ordered to the lines that had been there the night before. We this night completed laying out the works. The troops of the line were ready with entrenching tools and began to entrench after General Washington had struck a few blows with a pickaxe. A mere ceremony, that it might be said General Washington, with his own hands, first broke ground at the siege of Yorktown. The ground was sandy and soft, and the men employed that night ate no idle bread, and I question if they ate any other, so that by daylight they had covered themselves from danger from the enemy's shot, who, it appeared, never mistrusted that we were so near them the whole night, their attention being directed to another quarter. I do not remember exactly the number of days we were employed before we got our batteries in readiness to open up upon the enemy, but I think it was more than 2 or 3. The French, who were upon our left, had completed their batteries a few hours before us, but were not allowed to discharge their pieces till the American batteries were ready. Our commanding battery was on the near bank of the river and contained 10 heavy guns. Next was a bomb battery of 3 large mortars, and so on through the whole line. The whole number of the Americans and French was 92 cannon, mortars, and howitzers. Our flagstaff was in the 10-gun battery upon the right of the whole. I was in the trenches the day that the batteries were to be opened. All were upon the tiptoe of expectation and impatience to see the signal given to open the whole line of batteries, which was to be the hoisting of the American flag in the 10-gun battery. About noon, the much-wished-for signal went up. I confessed, I felt a secret pride swell in my heart when I saw the star-spangled banner waving majestically in the very faces of our implacable adversaries. It appeared like an omen of success to our enterprise. So it proved in reality. A simultaneous discharge of all the guns in the line followed, the French troops accompanying it with a huzzah for the Americans. It was said that the first shell sent from our batteries entered an elegant house. Eek. Formerly owned or occupied by the Secretary of State under the British government, and burnt directly over a table surrounded by a large party of British officers at dinner, killing and wounding a number of them. This was a warm day to the British. The siege was carried on warmly for several days, when most of the guns in the enemy works were silenced. We now began our second parallel, about halfway between our works and theirs. There were 2 strong redoubts held by the British on their left. It was necessary for us to possess those redoubts before we could complete our trenches. And that's where we're headed next, to redoubts 9 and 10. I love this place. Here's the ground that Plumb had to cover on his attack. And there is redoubt number 10. We are facing the French and the American second line, where the French and the English came from when they attacked redoubt number 10. And so back there is where Joseph would have been hiding or lying in wait. Crossing this ground and then up this way, up and over, ladder in hand. This is part 2. As Martin says, one afternoon, I, with the rest of our corps that had been on duty in the trenches the night but one before, were ordered to the lines. I mistrusted something extraordinary, serious, or comical was going forward. But what? I could not easily conjecture. We arrived at the trenches a little before sunset. I saw several officers fixing bayonets on long staves. I then concluded we were about to make a general assault upon the enemy's works. But before dark I was informed of the whole plan, which was to storm the redoubts, the one by the Americans, the other by the French. The sappers and miners were furnished with axes and were to proceed in front and cut a passage for the troops through the abatis, which are composed of the tops of trees, the small branches cut off with slanting stroke, which rendered them as sharp as spikes. These trees are then laid at a small distance from the trench or ditch pointing out towards, and the butts fastened to the ground in such a manner that they can't be removed by those on the outside. It is almost impossible to get through them, though these we were to cut a passage before we or the other assailants could enter. At dark, the detachment was formed and advanced beyond the trenches and lay down on the ground to await the signal for advancing to the attack, which was to be 3 shells from a certain battery near where we were lying. All the batteries in our line were silent, and we lay anxiously waiting for the signal. The 2 brilliant planets, Jupiter and Venus, were in close contact in the western hemisphere, the same direction the signal was to be given, when I happened to cast my eyes to that quarter, which was often, and I caught a glance of them. I was ready to spring on my feet, thinking that they were signal for starting. Our watchword was Rochambeau, the commander of the French forces. A good watchword for being pronounced Rochambeau. It sounded, when pronounced quick, like "Rush on, boys." We had not lain here long before the expected signal was given for us and the French, who were to storm the other redoubt by the 3 shells with their fiery trains mounting in the air in quick succession. The word "up, up" was then reiterated through the detachment. We immediately moved silently on towards the redoubt. We were to attack with unloaded muskets. Just as we arrived at the abatis, the enemy discovered us and directly opened a sharp fire upon us. We were now at a place where many of our large shells had burst on the ground, making holes sufficient to bury an ox in, the men having their eyes fixed upon what was transacting before them, were every now and then falling into these holes. I thought the British were killing us off at a great rate. At length, one of the holes happening to pick me up, I found out the mystery of that huge slaughter. As soon as the firing began, our people began to cry, "The fort's our own!" And it was "Rush on, boys!" The sappers and miners soon cleared a passage for the infantry, who entered it rapidly. Our miners were ordered not to enter the fort, but there was no stopping them. "We will go," said they. "Then go to the devil," said the commanding officer of our corps, "if you will." I could not pass the entrance we had made, it was so crowded. I therefore forced a passage at a place where I saw a shot had cut away at some of the abatis. Several others entered the same place. While passing, a man at my side received a ball on the head and fell under my feet, crying out bitterly. While crossing the trench, the enemy threw hand grenades, small shells, into it. They were so thick that at first I thought them cartridge papers on fire, but was soon undeceived by their cracking. As I mounted the breastwork, I met an old associate hitching himself down into the trench. I knew him by the light of the enemy's musketry. It was so vivid. The fort was taken, and all quiet in a very short time. Immediately after the firing ceased, I went out to see what had become of my wounded friend and the other that fell on the passage. They were both dead. In the heat of the action, I saw a British soldier jump over the walls of the fort next to the river and go down the bank, which was almost perpendicular and 20 or 30 feet high. When he came to the beach, he made off for the town, and if he did not make good use of his legs, I never saw a man that did. All that were in the action of storming the redoubt were exempted from further duty that night. We lay down on the ground and rested the remainder of the night, as well as a constant discharge of grape and canister shot would permit us to do. Standing on redoubt number 10, which is the French took. Back there is the second group of lines, and so the French would have crossed that ground and then come over this trench and through the abatis and up. The Americans, including Plumb, would have crossed that ground then to take redoubt number 10, or redoubt number 9, which is over there. And there is a view inside the redoubt that the French took. Not much space. From inside these redoubts, the fate of the nation was decided. The last part of Joseph Plumb Martin's account, Narrative of a Revolutionary Soldier or Private Yankee Doodle Dandy, is of the surrender of Lord Cornwallis. After we had finished our second line of trenches, there was but little firing on either side. After Lord Cornwallis had failed to get off upon the 17th day of October, a rather unlucky day for the British, he requested a cessation of hostilities for, I think, 24 hours, when commissioners from both armies met at a house between the two lines to agree upon articles of capitulation. We waited with anxiety the termination of the armistice, and as the time grew near, our anxiety increased. The time at length arrived. It passed and all remained quiet, and now we concluded that we had obtained what we had taken so much pains for which we encountered so many dangers, and so anxiously wished. Before night, we were informed that the British had surrendered and that the siege had ended. The next day, we were ordered to put ourselves in as good order as our circumstances would admit, to see what was the completion of our present wishes. The British Army marched out and stacked their arms. The trenches where they crossed the road leading to town were leveled and all things put in order for this grand exhibition. After breakfast on the 19th, we were marched on to the ground and paraded on the right-hand side of the road, which is this road right in front of you. So Joseph Plumb Martin would have been on the other side of the road right there, and the French forces on the left. We waited 2 or 3 hours before the British made their appearance. They were not always so dilatory, but they were compelled at last by necessity to appear, all armed with bayonets, fixed, drums beating, and facings lengthening. They were led by General O'Hara, with the American General Lincoln on his right, the Americans and French beating a march as they passed out between them. It was a noble sight to us, the more so as it seemed to promise a speedy conclusion to the contest. The British did not make so good an appearance as the German forces, but there were certainly some allowances to be made in their favor. The English felt their honor wounded. The Germans didn't greatly care whose hands they were in. The British paid the Americans seemingly but little attention as they passed them, but they eyed the French with considerable malice depicted in their countenances. They marched to the place appointed and stacked their arms. They then returned to town in the same manner as they had marched out, except being divested of their arms. After the prisoners were marched off into the country, our army separated, the French remaining where they were, Then were the Americans marching for the Hudson. And this is the surrender field. And this is where we will leave A Narrative Tale of Revolutionary Soldier, or Private Yankee Doodle, by Joseph Plumb Martin. Some of the adventures, dangers, and suffering of him.
All right, so one of my favorite parts of Joseph Plumb Martin's account is it's actually during the winter of Valley Forge in 1777. And he talks about how he's passing by a farmer's field where some pumpkins got overlooked or just kind of left over from the harvest. And he's hungry. He hasn't eaten for a couple of days at that point. So he actually talks about taking one of the pumpkins, says that he cuts it in half. He lays it so that the skin side is up on a stone, and then he piles hot coals over top of it to cook it. And we actually do that out here during our food waste presentation and program that we do over Thanksgiving weekend, and it actually works out pretty well. So I've done it, I've actually tried it, and yeah, not bad, especially if you hadn't eaten for the past 3 or 4 days.